Hi everyone, and welcome back to The Red Path. This is episode 1 of Berzerker Basics, a series where I'm going to be breaking down some common painting techniques and understanding the reason why we use them, talking about the methods behind them, giving you guys a better understanding of the system overall and understanding how you can break it yourself and apply it in ways that would suit yourself. So let's dive into the video and see what we've got. Okay, so in this first video, I'm going to be talking to you all about foundation paints and priming, why these are such an important step when it comes to painting, and sort of how they can influence the final aesthetic of your model, what goes into them in terms of like picking the foundation paints that you're going to be choosing for a certain project, picking the sort of primers that you're going to be using, all those kind of nitty-gritty things that maybe people sometimes do without knowing why they're doing it. So we're going to talk about why you do these things today, which will hopefully give you all a better understanding of that. And then, you'll be able to apply that in your own painting and maybe change things up a little bit from what you're already doing and overall give yourself a better painting experience. So let's dive into it. Okay, so let's start by talking about foundations and priming. So I have two models here. On the right we got a Terminator guy who is completely unprimed, and then we have a Warp Talon here who's seen a coat of Chaos Black spray. Now the thing about priming, it's I would always use the analogy of like building a house when it comes to painting. So when you're priming, you can think of that as like picking the foundation for your house. You're picking an area where you're pretty confident that it's a good place to build, that it's like a good starting point, and that's exactly what a primer is. It's a starting point for your models. Now, it's very important picking the right primer. So if we were to literally just talk about, we'll say the 30k white and blue world leader scheme, you really have two options for priming these models. So you can either prime them in white or you can prime them in black. Now, there's merits for both. Obviously, if you prime them in white, it's much easier to paint the model overall because, as I'm sure a lot of you know, painting white can be quite difficult just due to the heavy nature of the pigment, the fact that it's quite difficult to get on in a sort of uniform layer. But I think priming black has a lot more advantages over priming white. And this is a personal opinion. And as I'll explain why I make these decisions, hopefully you guys will understand the nature of priming and what kind of leads me to those decisions. So if we just think about those, right? So you're deciding on what primer you want to get. The most important thing you need to think about here is what is the darkest part of the model and what is the brightest part of the model. So if I'm priming in black, that's going to be the darkest color that goes onto the model, obviously, because it's black. So the most shadowed parts of the model are going to automatically become black, and it'll set the tone as we build up from that. Essentially, building up layers over a black primer will retain a certain element of that darkness. Now, you'll see this if you experiment around with yourself over a white prime model and a black prime model, that the initial coats will actually look very, very different from each other. So we'll say if you were painting a 40k Berzerker, like the guy I'm working on here, he's primed over a black coat. So you can see that the reds are very, very dark. They're coming in quite strong and very high contrast to the black underneath. If I was to have primed him white, we'll say, or a different color, the reds would interact differently. They would come out differently on your first layers. They would be much, much brighter and more vibrant. So that really depends on the kind of look you're going for. So maybe you want very bright reds, you want very striking colors. In that case, I would say lean towards a white primer. The primer serves as the foundation for the layers that you're building up over. So you can expect very bright results from a white primer, very dark results from a black. Equally, if you were to do metallic, some of that metallic primer is going to show through when you're painting your layers. Now, I don't mean you're going to get a metallic red, we'll say, if you were painting red, but your initial passes with your layers are going to leave you with a somewhat shiny and metallic look. Now, if that's, you know, kind of what you're going after, that's entirely fine. And one cool tip that I learned myself is that if you do prime something in metallic, like we'll say lead belcher, and you decide to use a contrast paint over that, like for example, we have here Flesh Tears Red, which is what I use sometimes when I'm doing this technique. So if you use a contrast paint over a metallic primer, you can actually get quite a metallic color result. So in that situation, I would have a very metallic red. Now the level of how metallic that red is going to look depends on how thick you go with the contrast paint. So that's a fun little tip if you're looking for a, I guess the best example would be like the Alpha Legion. You know, they have that very metallic teal look. So if I was to use a sort of mix of blue and green contrast paints to get a teal look, and then paint that in a fairly thin layer over a metallic primer, I would get that Alpha Legion look pretty quickly. Now, you know, it's contrast paint at the end of the day. You have to be careful when you're using that to make sure it doesn't go too blobby. But look, there's a cool tip. So that's kind of talking about the primers that we're using. And the reason we do that is just to seal the model at the very start. So if I was to start painting this guy here, this Terminator Lord I'm working on, if I was just to go straight in, start painting the white, it's not going to look good. It's going to look really streaky. There's going to be parts of the plastic that are coming through, and those streaky aspects, they're going to linger even as we build up the layers, and it's just going to be very, very difficult to get a nice consistent tone over the plastic, as well as the fact that it's just not a good idea in general to paint straight onto plastic. The pigments in paints don't really work for that. So by priming a model in whatever color primer you decide to go with at the start, you're really setting yourself a nice kind of like sort of base that you can work your first few paints up over. So personally, I generally lean towards black when it comes to priming my models, even though I paint them in the World Eater scheme. Like you can see this this Berzerker I'm working on here, like he's looking very white, but he has been hit with a black primer first of all. Now, my reasoning behind this, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize when they start priming with white, is that if you prime with something like Corax White or White Scar or whatever the white primer that you're using is, that is raw white. You know, that is bright white, and no matter what happens, that is going to like remain as a very stark white, which means that if you want to do highlighting or bright tones on the model, it's going to be almost impossible to highlight that white because it's already as bright as it can possibly be. Now, if you were to look at doing a black primer and then building up your white tones over that, you can do a lot of very, very interesting things. So if you would have watched my first video where we talk about doing the 30k color scheme, like what I'm doing on this guy, the white here isn't, though it looks white, it's not actually white. It's a very, very, very light brown. Now, that is really useful because when it comes to doing the armor chipping and highlighting, I can use pure white, like White Scar or Corax White, to highlight this model. But if I'd primed this guy white, I wouldn't be able to do that because by applying a highlight of Corax White over a primer of Corax White, it's not going to do anything. But because this white is actually a very light brown, I can highlight it freely. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I primed him in white. So that's something that you need to think about. And also, I find it very, very difficult to actually paint metallics over a white primer. And that's generally because, like, when you think of any metallic object, there's lots of shadow in it. There's lots of dark aspects. You know, that can be anything from like the legs of a knight to even the hilt of a chainsword or something like that. There's lots of dark elements in that. So if you're trying to build up a coat of metallic paint over a white primer, you're losing that dark shadow immediately. Now you can work that dark shadow back in with washes, but if you go over a black primer, those shadows are naturally there, which will mean that the washes can actually cling to those shadows much, much better, giving you a nicer overall tone. So that's sort of like the fundamentals behind why we prime our models. Now you can use stuff like Mephiston Red if you're going for the 40k scheme as well, or like any other red primer, which is entirely fine. But I would recommend that if you're going to go down that road, I would be doing a red color over that anyway. I wouldn't just stick with your Mephiston Red as your primed coat, because that's not always as perfectly even as you want it to be. And it's not necessarily the perfect tone either when it comes straight out of the rattle can. So it's something to be aware of, you know, choosing the right primer for the job at hand. So if you want to go for a very sort of vibrant classical GW color scheme, you might want to look to primers like Mechanica Standard Grey, Mephiston Red, even the White Spray as well. But if you're going for a darker, more realistic grimdark aesthetic, which is generally what I kind of lean towards, I'll be looking at my black primers or my brown primers. So that's a bit of information about the primer that you're picking and the right one for the right job. So let's start thinking about foundation paints in the next part. Okay, so let's assume you've primed your model. You know, you've picked your adequate primer and you're happy to start. So the first thing you're going to want to do after you've primed your model is hit it with a strong foundation color from which you're going to build up your final tone. Now, there's so many different colors you can pick from, and I'm not going to really be able to tell you guys which is the right one and which is the wrong one, but I can advise you on your selection here at this point. So in terms of GW and Citadel paints, they have a fantastic range of base paints, which are these red ones here. Now, these are really suitable for the foundation layer that you're going to be laying down. And the reason for this is that their pigment is often much thicker and much denser than the layer paints, so like the likes of Baneblade Brown here or Wordbearer's Red. So even if you compare, we'll say, Mephiston Red and Wordbearer's Red, while they are two different colors, the actual consistency of the paint is different. And this is because with the heavier pigments that you find in the base paints, they will more readily go onto a primed model. They will cover the surface area much better and with less sort of streaking, and generally will just kind of give a more solid tone on your first layer. Now, that's not to say that you can't use layer paints as your foundation. And in fact, if you will have watched the first episode of From Sprue to Skull Throne, where I painted a 30k World Eater, I used Baneblade Brown as my foundation paint. So this isn't actually a base paint, it's a layer paint, but I'm using it in place of a base paint just because I like having that tone, and there's nothing wrong with that. You just need to be aware that when you're watering down a layer paint like that for a foundational layer, you maybe don't want to water it down as much as if it was a layer, because otherwise it can take quite a while to build up. Like generally, it takes me 2 or 3 coats to get a consistent layer of Baneblade Brown down, but if I was to water that down to what I would normally use as a layer, it would take me maybe 4 or 5 coats to get something consistent. Conversely, something like Mephiston Red, Mournfang Brown, or Abaddon Black, they will far quicker build up that layer that you're looking for, so you're talking maybe 1 or 2 coats tops. This is all obviously heavily influenced by the primer that you've chosen as well. So something like a black primer, painting Baneblade Brown, which is quite a light brown, over that is going to take a little bit longer than if you were to do something like Mournfang Brown, which is darker. So you need to think about that when you're choosing your foundational layer. What primer have you got, and what paint will lean most towards that without it being too difficult for you to build up that foundation. Now, something else that's really important when you're picking your foundation paint is that it generally, at least in my case, it generally tends to be the color of the shadowed areas on the model. So for example, let's look at this Berzerker again that I was painting. You can sort of see in the greaves that there is a little bit of that Baneblade Brown foundation left behind. And the reason it's kind of creating a shadowed effect. Now, that's obviously not the finished sort of armor aesthetic. We're going to hit it with some more washes and stuff, but having that darker foundation tone in those recesses allows those washes to naturally move towards those areas and create interesting dynamics and shadows and stuff going on. Like, let's look here at the Berzerker that I'm working on. You can sort of see that while the red of the armor, it's very bright as we move up and away from the areas of shadow, but in those lingering bottom parts near the greaves, so we've got like this kind of area down here, it's very dark, and in that situation, that's pretty much just the foundation paint that I left in there. It's the same on the shoulder pads. You can see the nice gradation that we've got there. We have the foundation paint at the bottom working up towards the top brightest color. Now, in another video, we'll talk more about layering and my sort of 3-tone layer techniques, but when it comes to picking your foundation, you need to understand that most likely some of that color is going to be showing through if you want it to. Generally, I lean towards having some of that in there as it's a good contrast for your final overall armor color. So picking the right foundation is really important. I can't really emphasize that enough. When it comes to sort of red tones like the 40k color scheme, Mephiston Red is a pretty solid bet if you're going for a GW aesthetic. Khorne Red is a little bit pinky. I think it's too pink, and I've seen a lot of people say they're not quite happy with the effects from Khorne Red, and I kind of tend to agree. I shy away from it myself. But when it comes to doing, let's say, the 30k color scheme, you really need to think of a couple of different things. Are you going for a more browny, dirty armor or a cold sort of look? So when it comes to like the brown, dirty armor, I generally like my Baneblade Brown foundation layer. But if you're going for a cold, sort of white look, it's very hard to describe exactly what I mean by that, but imagine something that isn't dirty. You're looking for a cleaner aesthetic. You're going to want to lean into, say, a grey foundation layer. So I used to use a lot of this paint, Eshin Grey, as my foundation layer for that when I painted in that style back in the day. That's quite a good one for setting down the tone of a cold white. So having an understanding of the different, I would say, temperatures of paints. So we'll say Mephiston Red, that's a very warm red. And Wordbearer's Red, that's pretty warm too. Now Baneblade Brown, it's not so warm, you're leaning more towards a dirty look. And it's the same with Eshin Grey, that's quite a cold looking colour. That's really going to influence the final aesthetic for your layers. It's going to shape how they build up over time. And it's the same when it comes to metallics. It's a little bit different because metallics can be very fussy, and I know some people really dislike painting them, and I can't really fault them in that front. But when it comes to metallics, I like to go with a sort of a mid-tone kind of color when I'm starting out in my base layer. I wouldn't quite go as dark as I would be for the layers. So generally when it comes to metallics, I like to use something like, so we have polished metal here from Ammo Mig. Now an equivalent to that would be something like Iron Warriors from GW. So it's quite a dark steel, from which it's pretty easy to build up a lighter steel color, but it's not so dark that, you know, it's almost a shadowy steel, just because metallics tend to take the washes a little bit better, so you don't really have to work on building up that gradation that much. So yeah, picking your foundation, it's a tough part sometimes, and I would say you really need to sit down. If you're just starting out and you're saying, okay, cool, we're painting World Eaters, or we're painting whatever Legion or whatever army you're painting, get a couple of models. You know, they don't have to be necessarily from that range, but it's probably better if they are. We'll say pick out a box of like 5 Chaos Space Marines and try out 5 different foundation layers on them, and then work up, you know, your final armor color. We'll say if it's the 30k scheme or the 40k scheme. Let's take the 40k scheme for example. We'll take 5 models, and we're going to do one in a base coat of Wordbearer's Red, and then we're going to do one in a base coat of Mephiston Red. We might do one in Khorne Red as well, and then we might do 2 more where it's a mix of some of these paints put together. Then we're going to build up the rest of our armor, and we're going to look at the final aesthetic and see which of those matters and, you know, makes the most sense to us. It's the closest to what our goal was for the paint scheme. I'm telling you, even if you do the exact same thing after you put down the foundation layer, all those models are going to look different, just because the foundation has such a large impact on the final result. So I really take that time. I know it seems like arduous and boring, but believe me, and I'm speaking from my own experience here, because it genuinely took me about 2 years to find the correct foundation paint for my World Eaters. It took me a very, very long time to settle on Baneblade Brown. I went from Eshin Grey, I went from Mechanicus Standard Grey, I went from Administratum, I tried priming in white, I tried a lot of different browns and different mixes and stuff before I finally settled on this. And I know if I had just taken the time at the start to sit down and work through 5 models and try and pick out which one looks the best, I wouldn't have had that problem, and I wouldn't have maybe 30 or 40 Berzerkers that I'm looking back on now that don't really match my current aesthetic. So yeah, I think that's a really important part, and foundation paints play a lot more, a much bigger role than people give them credit for. So yeah, really guys, just sit down, you know, take some time to work out what you're going for, the sort of aesthetic you're looking for. So yeah, let's take a break and we'll come back to wrap this one up. Okay, so we covered some interesting points in today's video. So let's rewind and kind of review what we talked about. So first things first, you know, picking that primer, making sure that we have settled on the tone that we want to set for the model. You know, what's the sort of vision overall? What's the environment that the model is sort of living in? Is it a dark environment? Is it a very bright environment? Is it something in between? And have we picked a primer that's going to suit how that's going to look? So then we took a look at foundation paints, which are sort of the next step on along that path. What's the overall vibrancy of the color that we're looking to achieve? What's the really focusing on the tone of the actual model, you know, what's that base shadowed layer going to look like? Is it going to be very dark? Is it going to be bright? Is it going to be a very rich, we'll say red or blue or something like that? Or is it going to be something a lot more muted, a lot less saturated? So for that, we kind of looked at the different foundation paints you can use, the different layer paints you can use, all as a base layer for the final tone of, we'll say, the armor or the metallic aesthetics that are going to be coming through. So I think that's pretty much it for this episode of Berzerker Basics, guys. We've looked at some interesting things here. I think I've tried to break down the steps of my own sort of mindset as to why I do the things that I do, and I hope that can help you guys realize that you're not just priming a model for the sake of priming it because everyone told you that you have to. I hope now that you understand, okay, I'm priming this because it's setting the actual tone of the model. And okay, I'm doing this base coat not because Duncan told me that 2 thin coats is good, but because it's setting a standard for how the armor is going to look as the final product. So yeah, just the key tips from this. If you're unsure and if you're starting out in a brand new project, just take the time to find some models and practice. See the colors that you're working up, you know, see the final results, make sure you're happy with them. So in the next video, I think we're going to talk a little bit about my 3-tone layer technique and sort of what goes into that, how you guys can sort of manipulate that and make it your own, you know, change it around if you feel like it. So yeah, until then guys, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill main burn.